Welcome back to part 2 in this series around everything CLI related with Object First and OOTB. So in video 1, Jeff gave us an introduction on what the AWS CLI actually is, how to download it, and get started with some of the basics. In this video, part 2 of 3, Jeff is going to talk to us all about how to get specific with syntax usage and how to actually interact with the CLI. So Jeff, talk to us about the CLI and how you actually leverage syntax there.
Hi, Matt. Yeah, so this is probably the most, I'd say, terrifying thing for people who are not developers, which is me, for instance, because we're going into these files, which are called JSON files, and they can look a little bit intimidating, but they're not really, and especially for our use case, we don't need to know that much. We need to know a few things so we can leverage these. Now, we're going to talk about use cases later, but I actually have to say something about that now. Otherwise, you're going to say, well, Jeff, why do I want to do this in the first place? So what these policies are, they're ways to fine-tune your permissions in your buckets for different users, okay? Otherwise, you're going to have like one policy, and it'll be the default one, which comes from the Veeam server, and we'll talk about that next time. But there could be situations, and there are situations, when you want different ones. And I'll very quickly give you a bit of a sneak peek to the next video. One is DR testing. When you want to test a disaster recovery and you want to attach your DR server, so not your production server, to your bucket, your production bucket, and do restores. Well, guess what? In Veeam, you don't want to do that the normal method. Why? Because your DR VBR server will take ownership of your bucket. That is not good and certainly not recommended. But there's a trick. If you use one of these policies, which is restricted or read-only, it can read from the bucket, it can do your test restores, but it doesn't take ownership. So that's why we're making this big effort. Okay, so what is a JSON file? Well, here it is right in front of you. It's not that bad, and in fact, you don't really even have to type one. You can copy and paste, which I love doing. And if you really get good at this and you become like a super chef of JSON and IAM policies, then you might want to go and start really playing around with these. Otherwise, you could just copy some default versions. We're out on the Veeam website, have them as well, where you can just put these into your Veeam and they'll be there to restrict access for either your agents or in a DR policy situation. Okay, so what is this file? It's quite simple. The syntax, it's written in JSON, okay, and that's basically a format which computers can read very well. So computers need to understand these things. Just basic text they don't like, they can understand JSON format. So if we look at this, we have a version number. This is not the date. You're going to say, why are we in 2012, Jeff? No, that's the version, okay? So you don't have to worry about that. Then there's a statement, which is everything underneath here. We don't really even need to know that. The really important things that we need to focus on, the non-developer types, I would say, is the action, the effect, and the resource. And this is where you can really get technical, I would say to speak, or you can get restrictive. So in this policy here, I've called this dr-policy.json. Okay, you want .json because, in Windows especially, the operating system has to know what it is. And you'll be able to find it easier too. Action. So what are we doing here? S3, pretty straightforward. Get bucket location. S3, get object. S3, list all my buckets. This is pretty straightforward, right? So you're basically giving those permissions to whatever agent or even command line, for instance, if you're going to go through that way, which is entering your bucket or is trying to do something in your bucket. It's going to get these permissions, these things it can do. And again, there might be some that are a little more complicated. You can read about them, for instance, object legal hold, object retention, object lock configuration. So object lock, you hear that, you think immutability? Yes. This is a policy I've made for OOTB, DR testing. And important here, the effect, allow, because you can have an effect deny. Now, you can have more than one of these statements in here. So you could have a deny section if you wanted to, but we want to keep things simple. And the final thing I want to talk about is the resource. Now here, I've just made it global, as you can see. But you could go down to the bucket level. There's all sorts of things you can do. Obviously, if you're a person who deals with AWS all the time, you'll know this because you can use this all over AWS. In our case, it's that simple. The policy you're looking at right now is a policy which will allow me to attach a separate VBR server to a production bucket and not take ownership of it. So that's why we do it. And if you want, you could just copy that and use it and never again think about JSON. But I highly recommend you to get interested in this because it's a lot of fun. And in a lab, you can test it and play with it. By the way, you can also go to AWS. If you make a mistake, for instance, people say, well, you make a mistake if you decide to really type this out yourself. There is a policy simulator there. If you've got an AWS account, you can go in there and put your policy, and AWS will tell you if something's wrong with the syntax, whatnot. I haven't done that yet, but you're welcome to do that if you like. Okay, Matt, I'll hand it back to you now.
That's some really great insights, Jeff. When you threw out 2012 and all this JSON talk, it reminded me of the days of autoexec.bat and config.sys, like we're creating a batch file. So lots of really cool things you can do if you just take the time to understand the syntax, what commands are available, and how you can implement these. But like we said at the beginning of this video, Jeff, what good is all this if we don't give you guys some example use cases on how to put all this into practical application? So be sure to come back on the final video of this 3-part series where Jeff is going to talk to us about some of the really good use cases where this CLI client is exceptionally useful and frankly required to achieve some of these use cases. So we'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for tuning in.